So today's stream is community wealth building, one of my favourite topics. We have a wide range of speakers today. We're running 7 sessions throughout the day, and I'm really looking forward to them all. As per Monday, we'll go through each of the sessions. We'll do the housekeeping. We'll give you a little bit of introduction. So community wealth building, I guess you all know CLES. CLES talk about it being a people-centred approach to local economic development that redirects wealth and control back to local people. Community, well, if I was to look in my dictionary, it would talk about community being socially orientated group with common interest or locality. But actually, folks, community is about looking after each other. It's about the people around about you. It's leaving nobody behind. But definitions don't matter. You are living and breathing community wealth building. You might not even know that you're doing it, but many of you have a passion for it, and I know that firsthand from speaking to you. Today's sessions are to make you think, to make you proud, to challenge you, to make you think bigger, to make you move faster, to do more, and hopefully create a multiplier effect and gain from the synergy of the knowledge of the experience within the public sector as a whole. Our first session today is Democratic by Design, a new community wealth building vision for the British economy after Covid-19. And we're going to hear from Miriam Brett. Miriam is the Director of Research and Advocacy at Commonwealth. They are a UK-based think tank that work across the globe with a goal of steady and irreversible replacement of today's unequal extractive economy with one where freedom and solidarity and dignity are a universal inheritance. I love that. Actually, I wrote it down because I wanted to get it right. Miriam co-authored a paper, and I'll put the link to the paper later on if Miriam doesn't have it in her slides. And the paper argued that the COVID crisis has awoken people to the vital importance of community, and that's just great. And where we need to be is, this is a wake-up call to change course, and we need a new social contract and a genuinely inclusive economy. And I'll put that link up for the paper. We've asked Miriam along today to share her views and hopefully fuel that passion for change and community that you all have, and hopefully challenge you quite a bit too. So I'm going to hand over to Miriam now. Miriam.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Excellent, good stuff. Thank you so much for having me and inviting me here today. It's a real honour to be here. And you're going to be hearing from some absolutely incredible speakers throughout the day on all areas of community wealth building. So my job here is to really provide a kind of snapshot overview of some of the foundational pillars of community wealth building strategies, and then slot that into the context of where we're at today with regards to the economic recovery from COVID-19 and its economic shock. And then look at Scotland in the context of Scotland, what's happening in Scotland just now, what kind of are the key areas for opportunities, and how should we shape and build community wealth building across Scotland. So I'll turn to my first slide, if that's okay. Great. So the proliferation of local community wealth building strategies, for me, really demonstrates an appetite and momentum behind the movement for a more democratic economy. And I think part of that is growing out of an increase in recognition that the system, the current economic system, is not working for local economies. And what I mean by that is some of the conventional wisdoms around economic development so often fail to address the multiplying and intertwined crises facing our communities, whether that's the inequality crisis, whether that's climate and environmental crisis. And at the heart of this is that the concentrated ownership of wealth and power that is designed into our economy can act to strip workers and communities of the wealth that they create in common. And this has impacted local economies massively. It's had a hollowing out effect on local economies. And this matters because levels of inequality are unacceptably high still. So the highest fifth, yes, sorry, just checking the slides. The highest earning fifth of households in Scotland account for 42% of income, whereas the lowest earning fifth account for just 7%. So That's quite extreme. And wealth inequality is even more acute. So 41.5% of Scotland's wealth is owned by just 10% of the population, amounting to 5 times the total wealth held by the poorest half of the population. And 25% of people in Scotland have less than £500 of net savings, and 7% have zero savings or are in debt. And this has been exacerbated by a decade of austerity following the last financial crisis, and a squeeze on real wages as well. What community wealth building does is offer an opportunity to look at an alternative approach to local economic development, one that actively redirects wealth back into the local economy and places control and benefits into the hands of local people, supporting thriving communities that centre democratic, equitable and sustainable place-based economic strategies. Now, given that there's a growing appetite for community wealth building in Scotland and beyond, which is incredible, I think it's really important to set out here what community wealth building is and what it is not. So community wealth building is not a patchwork of individual good policies and practices. It's not merely about advancing individual enterprises or cooperatives or grassroots projects. While all of those things are good, community wealth building is a transformative local economic systems change approach. So it needs to be understood as something that is fully integrated and rooted in transforming local economies from the ground up. So this approach must realise its potential to develop institutions and build a new ecosystem rooted in participation and ownership by the community that can ensure a power base for long-term sustainability. So great. So what is community wealth building? So what I'm drawing from here is the 5 pillars set out by Cless. You'll be hearing from Neil later on, which is great, and he'll delve into some of the, so he'll do a bit of a deeper dive into this, and I'll provide an overview of the 5 pillars of and principles of community wealth building as set out by Cless. So wealth remains highly concentrated in the hands of a few, as we saw with the examples in Scotland. And this situation has been exacerbated by an approach to economic development that results in wealth being created, but not always flowing back to communities, to local economies. And the economy, I think, as highlighted by the pandemic, is marked by long-standing injustices, imbalances and inequalities. So almost a quarter of all households in the household wealth in the UK is held by the richest 1% of the population. So at the heart of community wealth building rests a drive to restore social fabric by connecting people to places that create wealth. And key to that is creating a pluralist landscape for business models that are the lifeblood of local economies and communities, and models of businesses that give back to those economies and those communities. So by rooting our response to the pandemic and its economic shock, we can lay a groundwork for pluralist business models to thrive. That means safeguarding a prosperous future for social enterprises. That means rapidly expanding worker ownership of companies. That means facilitating the growth of cooperatives and mutuals. And that means securing a path forward to enhance community businesses. Now, at the core of this, these are all businesses that are socially minded, and they are likely to employ, invest and buy locally. So the second pillar set out by Cless is making financial power work for local places. So access to credit is a driving force behind the ability of local businesses to thrive and prosper. It enables them to operate, grow, expand and invest. Our approach to local development, however, the kind of conventional wisdoms around that has often been geared towards international markets, which, while important, that's had the impact of detracting focus from local level investment. So in place of this, what we need to see is a rapid increase of flows of investment within and to local economies. This is particularly critical at a time when the high street is facing such an acute crisis following a lending slump to small businesses, as well as local bank branch closures, which have disproportionately impacted low-income households, small businesses and people in rural areas. So reconnecting lenders with their local communities can and should be a priority. That means channeling sustainable investment to communities, while delivering steady flows of financial returns to investors. So this could be achieved in Scotland through a number of ways, and I'll set out just a couple of them here. So one is reorienting local authority pension funds to local schemes and creating and harnessing mutually owned banks to grow local markets. So it can also be invested and channeled towards local communities. We also need to think about unleashing the potential of the Scottish National Investment Bank. So the bank, to help alleviate the financial gap that pluralist business models face, the Scottish National Investment Bank could steer financing to public and private bodies that serve a social and environmental purpose, and provide patient risk capital to safeguard long-term funding, shifting the traditional investment focus of maximising returns to tackling the key challenges we face today. Next slide, please. Brilliant. So pillar 3 is that of fair employment and just labour markets. Again, this is something that's even more critical in a post-crisis recovery setting. So the labour market remains highly imbalanced, and the pandemic has exposed deep fractures in it that have existed for too long. We saw workers being laid off, facing increasing precarious employment. Fire and rehire was and remains rife, and workers have faced significant health and safety violations throughout the pandemic as well. According to new research by IPPR2, poverty rates among working households in the UK are at an all-time high. So it's critical that sustaining and creating jobs in this really deeply turbulent economic period, that should of course be a priority, but the quality of those jobs matters. Now, while the majority of employment law is reserved to Westminster, there are some limitations to what can be achieved at a national level in Scotland, but action can be taken in Scotland to support local best practices. So community wealth building sets out not only to support employment opportunities, but to dramatically enhance workers' rights by, as Class states, promoting recruitment from lower income areas and inclusive employment practices, committing employers to paying the real living wage and building progressive routes for employment, as well as encouraging anchored institutions to bring about progressive employment practices to transform local labour market activities. So I just want to highlight one example here, which is that of Preston. Many of you may have heard of the Preston model. It took off and has subsequently thrived. And since the rollout of community wealth building in Preston, which followed engagement with a series of anchor institutions, the council, the Community Gateway Housing Association, colleges, 4,000 extra employees in Preston are now receiving the real living wage. That was as of 2018. So it has real and meaningful impact on making the labour market fairer and more just. The fourth pillar is something you will all be very familiar with, which is progressive procurement of goods and services. So what this aims to do is shift focus around procurement from narrow definitions of financial cost towards the inclusion of important factors like environmental consequences, workers' rights, and social value, rather than seeing them as secondary priorities. What community wealth building advocates is progressive procurement practices that harness spending power and challenge it to benefit sustainable, resilient communities. By gearing anchored institutions to develop their procurement practices to help create and sustain dense local supply chains, with a particular focus on supporting plural forms of business ownership like cooperatives, social enterprises and employee-owned businesses. So one option here could be to look at mandatory social licensing for providers of goods and services, meaning that providers can only enter the market if they have business practices guaranteeing the provision of social benefits to communities and stakeholders. These businesses are often rooted in local economies, so harnessing their potential is important here because we can redistribute wealth locally. Again, an example of Preston is that by transforming procurement practices, procurement spend retained in Preston was 112 million. That's a sharp increase in the 74 million witnessed in that we saw in 2012 to 2013. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. Ownership of land and assets is the final principle here. So socially just use of land and property, looking at how the ownership of land and assets is managed, how it's owned, and this is of vital importance to community wealth building. So this is also acutely relevant to Scotland, because Scotland's land ownership remains highly concentrated despite recent progress in recent years to tackle that. So 57% of Scotland's rural land is in private hands, with only 12.5% owned by public bodies, 3% under community ownership, and about 2.5% is owned by charities and other third sector organisations. So still highly imbalanced. And this matters because land is an important expression of power in society. So too few are set to see the immense profits off the back of it, and this concentration continues to be a source of inequality. And at a local level, economic pressure and the drive to enclose land ownership for private interests has resulted in local authorities selling off land and property assets. And this approach needs to be turned around. So instead, looking at how we can build local wealth via equitable forms of land ownership, management and development to really harness and utilise the potential of these assets for social and environmental good. So a community wealth building approach, under that, assets can be owned and managed in ways that ensure they generate wealth for local people, for local communities, rather than simply serving private interests. And what that does is encourage and facilitate, well, at the heart of that rather, is encouraging and facilitating participation in how land is used and managed. Now, as Cless sets out, the goal is not simply for local authorities to increase their stake in land ownership, but also to reshape how land is owned, in whose interest, how it's managed, and expand the public commons to build everything from shared buildings to looking at how we reimagine green spaces and how they're operated. So this is particularly critical as we face the economic crisis and start to rebuild the economy from it, not least because there's a heightened need to regenerate and repurpose our high streets. So areas like commercial property are likely to experience very acute distress, and we already saw that during the pandemic, and I think that's probably going to be a longer term trajectory, unfortunately. So the question of how the future liabilities of these properties are put into use, their carbon output, their social use, all of that is vital. And to build a more collaborative and participatory approach to public land ownership, the management and governance of assets needs to be reimagined. So, for example, that could look at identifying underutilised assets or assets left vacant from COVID's economic shock, and transferring them to, for example, community land trusts to deepen citizen participation in municipal assets and retain and advance community benefits. Next slide, please. So just now we sit at a historic juncture. If we are to secure a transformative and sustainable recovery from this crisis, then the crisis could prove to be a watershed moment, a way to break from an unsustainable past and present, and move towards a reparative future that is anchored in purposeful, inclusive economy. So in that sense, the crisis could well be a wake-up call to change the course and build a more local, generative, social and democratic economic system, and a moment of crystallisation with citizens and governments working together to build a new social contract. That, of course, is a wider aim than just at a local level. That needs to be done at every single level. But the path we take will depend on the actions we take now. So the economy has been drastically reshaped throughout the pandemic. High streets are facing really difficult times ahead. We know that local businesses, many of them, are struggling to stay afloat, and there's been relatively high levels of unemployment as well. And early indicators of the effects of COVID-19 suggest that it could drastically exacerbate levels of inequality. I think we already saw that during the pandemic with how the pandemic actually hit different groups in society, and who bore the disproportionate cost of it. if we're to see an acceleration of a growing concentration of power and wealth in the hands of the few at the aftermath of this pandemic, we know what the result is from that. It's a concentration of firms, of ownership, of influence of the economy, and with a growing proportion of shareholder power and wealth. And that is runs in sharp contrast to many of the societal and climate and environmental goals that we need to strive for just now. So without intervention, I think there's a danger that we could see what we at Commonwealth term an Amazon recovery, if we're not careful, where big business become even more powerful and further consolidate their wealth and power. But while the pandemic exposed deep fractures in the economy, the crisis has also underscored the importance of community. And as we begin to reconstruct the economy, we need to strive to ensure that the recovery has a starting point of a new birth of community. And the present crisis makes the case, I believe, obviously I'm biased, for community wealth building to be stronger, just as it strengthens the potency of the challenges to which community wealth building is a response to. So a new era of community wealth building could be the basis of local level economic transformative plans to create the kinds of democratic, inclusive and community-based economies that we need. Those are economies that are centred on well-being, they're centred on resilience, they're centred on ecological sustainability and on economic justice. Important too is the potential that community wealth building has to unlock local Green New Deals. So from capital investment to from using capital investment to invest in low carbon projects that create good unionised local green jobs, to reorienting pension funds and municipal bonds to finance a just transition, to the environmental benefits of local supply chains. Many of the tools of community wealth building can be used to join together economic and environmental and climate justice. So there's a real potential there to see local Green New Deals as part of this. Last slide, please. Thank you. So what next for Scotland? So in both our Democratic by Design paper that was mentioned earlier and a paper that I co-authored with the Scottish economist Laurie McFarlane, we set out the need for a Community Wealth Building Act, and we're absolutely delighted to see that as part of the upcoming agenda in the Scottish Government. And we've also seen a new ministerial portfolio created, which includes community wealth and explicit portfolio focus on community wealth. So what we believe we need to see just now is a Community Wealth Building Act that draws on experience of local authorities that have already initiated such a strategy, such a programme, bringing together best practices of the 5 pillars set out by CLES to develop national integrated strategy to retain and grow local wealth and reduce inequality. While community wealth building needs to be coordinated at a local level, this is a locally driven and locally led strategy. With those invested in local communities driving change, measures can be taken at a national level to facilitate its rollout. And I think the Community Wealth Building Act presents an opportunity to codify a path forward, to identify the structural barriers to community wealth building strategies and foster its aims going forward. Importantly, there's no one-size-fits-all model to community wealth building. While they're all rooted in the foundational 5 principles, each of these strategies is tailored to the specific local context, which is why changes at a national level need to be about facilitating locally led and locally driven strategies, because each local rollout of community wealth building is different. It's based on the context, on the ecosystem, on resources, on local politics, and it's shaped in accordance with that and the needs of local communities. So what all community wealth building strategies have in common is that they aim to improve the ability of communities and individuals to increase asset ownership, anchor jobs, and resources locally, expanding the provision of public services and ensuring that local communities are have economic stability and democratic control. And I think looking ahead at the growing appetite in Scotland just now, at the Community Wealth Building Act, at the new ministerial portfolio, but also at local levels, just seeing a real groundswell in appetite for community wealth building strategies is incredibly encouraging, but importantly can be a really critical tool to shape how we rebuild our way and reconstruct the economy as we rebuild it out of the crisis. I've probably spoken for a little bit too long, so I'll round up there.
Miriam, you were perfectly on time, so well done. I'm going to open up for questions now, and while people are just contemplating and putting their hands up, I'll start off and ask you a question, Miriam.
Yeah.
Within your document, you talked about we're at a crossroads.
Yes.
We're at a crossroads of decisions. The paper was published 8 months ago.
Yeah.
Have you seen signs that we're taking the right path? What are those signs that you would look for in Scotland to indicate that we're taking the right path and that we're going in the right direction?
Oh, great question. Yeah, so I mean, I think there has been some encouraging signs, I would say, fairly across the board with many of the main parties in Scotland. I was impressed by the level of ambition seen in areas of their manifestos ahead of the election. And I think that demonstrates a growing appetite for a change in the way that we approach economic development. I mean, in terms of the recovery, specifically with community wealth building, I think there's a real potential there with the Community Wealth Building Act. If it is shaped properly, if it is about unleashing the potential of locally driven and locally led economic strategies for community wealth building, I think it has incredible potential to help build our way out of the recovery and build something much better than what we had before as well, recognising that the way in which the economic crisis hit really exposed deep fault lines and fractures in the economy that have existed for far too long, as well as, of course, creating new vulnerabilities. And we saw that in the way that the labour market, people faced problems in the labour market. We saw that crisis of local and small businesses. We saw that with rent arrears. You know, that was every area of the economy. You could see the disproportionate impact that had on low income and marginalised groups. And I think looking towards how we rebuild and reconstruct our way out of that crisis, rooting that in community wealth building strategies that are grounded in those 5 principles is a really nice antidote, I think, to the way in which economic development has been viewed for too long. So I think that has really incredible potential. I think there's always room for improvement, and what, you know, for example, I think one of the things that is really critical to aid our recovery and that was missing from the budget in March in Westminster was a really comprehensive stimulus package that can create good, unionised, secure, green jobs the length and breadth of the UK. So I think that's one thing that we definitely still need to see. And I think there's always room for more ambition as well in Scotland too. Looking at some of the measures set out there, looking at how do we actually harness the potential of the Scottish National Investment Bank? I think that'll be a really interesting question in this Parliament now that it's set up and established. Similarly, looking towards other institutions like the Scottish Energy Company, what will that look like? What role will that have in facilitating a just transition? Yeah, so I mean, there's 101 things that we could do as well. I think I was broadly quite encouraged by the level of ambition in areas of different manifestos in the run up to the election.
Okay, thank you, Miriam. We've got our first hand up, and it's Mark Allen. Mark, could you take yourself off mute, please, and let you ask your question? Go for it, Mark. hopefully. Okay, we'll come back to Mark. Mark, one of the guys will be in touch and we can work out what's going on with you. Let me ask you one of the questions from the chat, Miriam. And I don't know if you know, but throughout your presentation there was a lot of debate going on as well. So lots of things going on in responding to your presentation. So let me ask you a question. Is there a source of, and it's from Nick Hyde, is there a source of information where we can identify local community organisations or local suppliers easily to inform strategies and engagement?
Oh, that's a great question, and I'm so sorry, I actually don't have the answer to that. But I will look it up and get back to you on that. Yeah, I'm not actually too sure where that source of information would be. I presume there will be one. I hope there's one. But I can look it up and send over the information to Stephen.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask you another question.
Yeah.
It's from Bridget Lambert at Renfrewshire Council. Now, Bridget's put it in the chat, and Bridget's not normally that shy, right? So I'll read out her question for you. And if I get it wrong, I'm sure Bridget can come back in. Can you explain a little bit more about mandatory social licensing? Does this relate to a requirement to include community benefits in our contracts, which require local benefits from communities? Are you ready for this? If so, then this is very achievable and something that most of us are already doing. If, however, you might need a pen here, Miriam, right? If, however, it relates to mandating the use of local supply chains, this might be harder to achieve alongside our current obligations to treat all economic operators in a fair and non-discriminatory manner. Bridget says she's not averse to this approach, but we would need to find a way to do this within the current regulatory regime in Scotland.
Great. Okay, so excellent question. So I think in terms of social licensing, I should say as well, we weren't extremely prescriptive with what we wanted to see there. I think that's one thing that could come out of the Community Wealth Building Act, looking at how our approaches to social licensing could be developed and evolve and grow. In terms of what we broadly meant by social licensing, just looking at an approach to mandatory social licensing, which would effectively result in providers only being able to participate in particular markets should they have changed and adapted their practices and guaranteed the provision of social benefits to communities and stakeholders. So that's not to say that this doesn't already exist and that a lot of councils aren't already doing that just now, and that's brilliant. I think it would be looking at how we could better kind of align that to be the default norm strategy rather than examples of really great practice. And I think that, again, I think there's always areas to build on that too, kind of if we're looking at what conditions we might want for social licensing and expanding and growing on that, that we've got some areas of, community benefits, there might be ways to enhance that, there might be ways to better link that up with employment practices. If we're looking at living wage employment, for example, would be another example there. So yeah, so that's not to say that there aren't examples of brilliant practice just now. I think it would just be the case of trying to have that as a default setting for across the board practice.
Okay, thank you.
Does that answer the question?
I think so. I've actually got a follow-on from that from Derek Hamilton, right? Just to make it a wee bit harder for you, Miriam, but it's not. You talked about the Act, and I've heard more and more people talking about the Community Wealth Building Act.
Yeah.
Are you aware if there has been a discussion with Scottish Government to change existing legislation, such as moving from consideration to mandatory inclusion of community benefits in regulated procurement?
I'm not aware of that. I think one of the challenges of the Act will be if it's carried out in the way that I want it to be carried out, which is rooted in those 5 principles that I went over, developed by Cless. It actually crosses a huge area of portfolios within government. And I think the breadth and scale of the kind of policy changes needed to facilitate that will be quite substantial. So, everything from land reform would be included in that, to procurement practices. So I'm not too sure as of yet, and I look forward to seeing what exactly will come of the Community Wealth Building Act, and how that actually links into existing legislation as well. I certainly hope that it'll be a comprehensive approach that actually looks at all of these different areas of community wealth building, and builds from that. I think there's also different areas of legislation that will be going through Parliament shortly as well. We don't have I don't know of the timeframes yet, but there's other areas of legislation that I think will be really interesting to see how they interlink with community wealth building as well. So the sustainability and well-being bill, for example, I'd be really interested to see, you know, how that links with community wealth building, and indeed how Community Wealth Building Act links with the sustainability and well-being bill, because I think if it's carried out correctly, it'll tap into a whole series of economic kind of portfolio areas. So the short answer there is I don't know where, but I look forward to finding out, and I look forward to seeing the development of it. I look forward to the I think there'll be a consultation as well, so I look forward to the consultation. We'll definitely be participating in that.
Okay, thank you, Miriam. Miriam, we're going to try and bring Mark Allen in again. And Mark in the chat was saying that he quite likes the idea of having a mute button for people, particularly somebody like me. But we're going to try again and see if we can unmute Mark. Mark.
Stephen, Miriam, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Mark.
Oh, thanks very much, Stephen. And this was Stephen's worst nightmare. Me that he can't mute. Oh, and damn, I do apologise. My question's pretty less sophisticated than some of the other ones, I'm afraid. It was particularly about locality, in the context, particularly perhaps of the fourth pillar and local supply chains. I'm wondering, how local is local? I know it's a thread that runs right through community wealth building, but and I'm particularly conscious that some of our local elected members might have a particular view of what local means, so I'd be interested to expose that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I suppose because community wealth building strategies are carried out at a local authority level, that kind of sets the boundaries, if you like, as to what would be classified as their idea of local there. But I think what's really interesting to look at as well is where that investment rests locally too. So in some areas you might have hubs of investment, and that's great, and the overall investment is increasing, but it might all be going to one area. So I think looking at kind of how you can rebalance that out throughout local authorities, as well as just driving investment into local communities, into local economies, is looking at, you know, how do you rebalance local investment within local areas as well, so that you don't have imbalances within those, such stark imbalances within those communities.
That's great, thanks, William. Yeah, the kind of thing, the thing that struck me is that this might be ancient history in economic development terms, but I'm conscious of old things like travel to work areas and things we looked at actually where the economic impact ranged, and it strikes me that perhaps just looking at it on a local authority basis is a bit narrow, that there are some natural local economic ties across regions, across areas, dare I say, across Scotland, that might be difficult to actually unlocalise, if we can put it that way.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, I think none of this sits in isolation as well. You know, there's the regional development, national development, and you need to pull levers at different levels to facilitate locally led and locally driven economic systems change approach as well. So none of it sits in isolation with anything else. You know, if we're looking at wider regional changes, you know, comprehensive strategies to good, sustainable, socially just, environmentally friendly economic development at regional levels will have a knock-on impact on locally led strategies for community wealth building, and vice versa as well. So, you know, none of that sits while those strategies are overseen at a local authority level, none of that sits in isolation to anything else. And I think it's about really harnessing different tiers of government to example there at Highlands and Islands, exactly, to try and unleash the potential.
Mark, it's a great question, and at Scotland Intel we run a workshop within councils. We've run, I think, 7 of them so far, And that's the first thing we ask the group, and the group is typically officers across the organisation. And the first thing we say, well, okay, you talk about local procurement, what's local? We have a different answer every time, Mark.
Yeah.
So one of the early ones we run in Clackmannanshire. Clackmannanshire has the second lowest number of resident businesses in a council area in Scotland. So Clackmannanshire look at it as Forth Valley. However, that may be a different view, quite rightly, Mark, as you say, when an elected member is sitting there. When I ran the session in Edinburgh, Edinburgh talked about reducing that local, and they talked about the 10-minute walk. You know, and I'm thinking, right, is that a fast walk or a slow walk? You know, about what that community and what that local is. So you're right, Mark, it's a real dichotomy, but it's something we need to get our arms around when we're talking about things like local procurement. But we need to recognise that it's different. And I see from some of the comments, you know, Sylvia's made a comment about Highlands and Islands enterprise across different areas. I think it's safe to say local isn't just your local council area. I think that's probably safe to say at this stage. Miriam, we've got lots of other questions, and questions we don't get to ask you, we'll perhaps send to you, and we'll get them and we'll put them onto our Academy Answers.
Send them to my email and I'll get back to you there.
Brilliant. I'm going to ask you one. I'm going to pick one last one. Which one should we pick? It's from Tanita. Tanita, thanks for your presentation, Miriam. In what ways do you see the proposed Community Wealth Building Act building on the Community Empowerment Scotland Act 2015?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And actually, that was the act exactly that I was thinking of when I was thinking about how it links and how they're all joined together. Again, I mean, without having, you know, I don't know what the act will say yet. What I hope it'll be is a really comprehensive strategy at a national level to look at all of these foundational pillars and help harness that to achieve locally led strategies. I think if that is the case, then I think looking at how this interlinks with sustainability and wellbeing, with land reform legislation, with the Community Empowerment Act will be absolutely vital, because it taps into all of these areas. If we look at those 5 principles, we're looking across massive areas of government portfolios, and that's what I hope it will be, because I think that's what it needs to be. So yes, I don't know what the Act itself will look like just yet, but I really hope that not only for the Act itself, I think it's also looking at, you know, how does this not have a knock-on effect if we're serious about building community wealth building strategies in Scotland, you know, which early indications seem to be that we absolutely are. And we've seen incredible examples in Scotland as well. I'm lucky to sit on the advisory group of the North Ayrshire Community Wealth Building Strategy, which has just been absolutely incredible. So there is a real appetite for this just now, but I think if we're gonna do this properly, it needs to be integrated actually into not only the Community Wealth Building Act itself, but looking at, you know, how does community wealth building relate to community empowerment? How does it relate to land reform legislation? So how do we integrate it there? How does it relate to sustainability and wellbeing legislation? So how is it integrated there? And taking a much more kind of systemic, comprehensive approach to community wealth building. So I think the Community Wealth Building Act itself, I hope, will be very, very important to kind of solidifying and codifying all of that. But then also going forward, you know, not seeing that as a one-off process, but seeing that as something that we can build on and develop through other areas of legislation as well.
Okay, Miriam, that was great, and thank you very much. As I said, we've got a number of other questions. We'll send them to you and we'll post them on the Academy afterwards, folks. So Miriam, I'd like to thank you for your presentation today, really interesting.
Thank you.
Also want to thank the audience for the questions, lots of really good questions in there. I guess the next session we are running is integrating health and wellbeing into economic recovery. That will run from 10 o'clock till 10:30, and again, folks, if you could log in 5 to 10 minutes beforehand, that would be great to allow us to get the next session started on time. So thank you very much, and Miriam, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.